Do I use wet and wet or wet and dry? Hi friends, Emily here. If you've been painting with watercolor for a while, you've probably heard these terms before, wet and wet and wet and dry. Painting wet and wet involves painting on a pre-wet surface, and painting wet and dry is exactly like it sounds. You're using wet paint on a dry paper. In today's video, I want to show you how you can use these two different techniques to get almost identical results if you know how to blend. So check it out. I've painted these two little robin's eggs side by side, and I want you to guess which one was painted wet and wet and which one was painted wet and dry. So today I'll take you step by step through the process of how I painted both these eggs using the two different techniques. And spoiler alert, this one is wet and wet, this one's wet and dry. So if you guessed that, good job. It's so important to practice both of these techniques in watercolor just so you have more tools in your tool belt to create amazing paintings. So let's get into it. I'm starting out by drawing these two eggs side by side. This one will be in a little different position, a little different shape than the first egg, but they'll be nestled right up next to each other. We're imagining an overhead view as if the camera was looking right down into the nest. Drawing doesn't have to be perfect, we're just putting these in for the sake of comparison. Okay, so there's my two little eggs. We are going to start with the wet and wet egg, and so this one is going to be a demonstration of blending using just the wet and wet technique. So I have my silver black velvet size 8 round brush. This is a nice brush because it's a combination of natural and synthetic hairs, and it just has a really nice springy feel to it. It's great with absorbing the paint and the water and releasing it easily onto the paper. One of my favorite brushes. So we're going to start with clean water, just dropping that into the egg. You could also start with a tinted wash if you prefer. You don't have to start on just a white surface. You can make the paper wet using colored water too. So keep that in mind when practicing wet and wet. It doesn't have to be just pure water. Depends, of course, on what you're painting. I do want to leave a couple of white highlights on the egg, so I'm going to make it pure white, beginning with. Imagine that you're painting with white when you're painting with water. You're staying inside of your lines, assuming you don't want any soft edges. We're just going to work on just the area within the egg. Okay, so once you have a nice glossy surface, you can begin with your first color. I'm going to grab, this is Holbein turquoise blue. I think it'll be a perfect color for these eggs. And I'm going to start on the outer edge where the paint is going to need to be the darkest. When I have a fully loaded brush, I tend to start in the areas that are darker so that I can put down the darkest pigment where it needs to go. Makes sense, right? And towards the top of the egg is where I'm going to have these highlights. So as my paint gradually wears off the brush, you can see it's starting to get a little lighter towards the center of the egg. And because we pre-wet the surface of the paper, everything looks super soft and blended. This is truly the easiest way to create the softest blended edges with really very little effort. It just takes a little bit of practice figuring out how much water needs to be in your brush versus your paper. So here around this highlight, I'm just kind of manipulating the paint a little bit to ensure that I get the highlight shape that I want. Something like that. Now I need to work quickly while this is still wet. I'm going to grab another color. This is marine blue, another Holbein color. I'm going to use that to really boost the blue in the shadow of the egg. Make it even more vibrant, richly pigmented. This is the shadow side, so we want to go darker here, and I have to work while it's still wet. You have a limited amount of time when you're working wet and wet to get these soft blends. As it begins to dry, you'll have to wait until it dries completely before you can go back and do another wet and wet layer. But while it's damp or wet like this, you can get away with a few more layers. So I am using that marine blue around the edges just to darken. I'm going to lighten that up just a little and add one more soft layer across the top. And I may have had a little too much water in my brush for that. We'll have to see. And one more time, while this is still wet, let's add a final wet and wet layer using burnt sienna. That might be surprising, but I want the bottom of the egg to reflect the colors of the nest around the egg. So a little bit of brown will help neutralize the blue, creating a softly blended dark shadow that's somewhat reflecting the colors of our imaginary nest around the egg. I just love the look of a spontaneous wet and wet painted object. It just looks so cool. And while it's still wet, feel free to push and pull the paint. If you're seeing some edges forming that just aren't quite what you're looking for, You have a little bit of time to play with that. But as I said, as it begins to reach this kind of danger zone where it's beginning to dry out too much, you may need to step back and let it dry all the way. And I think we're beginning to approach that, so I better leave that alone. Okay, let's go to the other egg, and this one we're going to paint wet on dry. So to do wet and dry, when you have multiple values, you can approach it using layers, wet and dry layers, using glazing. We're going to start again with that turquoise blue. This time I'm beginning with a really light wash. So this is going to represent the lightest color on the egg. And I'm just going in very directly, painting a nice tinted wash, leaving just a little hint of the highlight there. And I work so much with wet and wet that I'm tempted to just go in right now while it's wet and paint some darker values in there. But we're going to let each layer dry in between. If you have a heat tool, that can help speed up this process. For my next layer, I'm just going to use some more turquoise blue. I need to make sure that that's completely dry before going in with more paint. Now with this one, once again, I'm going to paint around the highlight. Because I'm painting wet on dry, everything that I apply, every layer, every brush stroke that I put down is leaving a hard edge. And we want this to look like a soft and smooth egg, so we must resolve those hard edges by blending. So we need to do that quickly. I'm going to rinse out what's on my brush, and I have a paper towel over here that I'm drying on. And then I'm going to soften along the edge that I just laid down by gently scrubbing around it. This is easiest to do while the edge of that paint is still wet. And here you can even see a little bit of a hard edge that formed there. That's because it dried so quickly. But we can just scrub around it. Here's where it's so important to not have too much water in your brush, to ensure that you don't have any blooms or blossoms forming. The dreaded cauliflower effect. Okay, so there it's blended. Let's dry that. And let's do another wet on dry glazed layer. We're going to use turquoise blue once again. Try to work quickly. We want to resolve those edges as quickly as possible. And this can be tricky when you're trying to work around your pencil marks, but I'm going to go ahead and remove some, blot on the paper towel, and then soften that edge. As I approach the highlight, I need my values to get lighter, so I'm working my way carefully around it, removing, blotting on the paper towel, and softening. Removing, blotting on the paper towel, and softening. So this is kind of a repeated process that you need to do when you're working wet and dry. Let's dry that layer. Okay, the next layer is going to be our marine blue, so a bit darker now. I am swirling it on the palette with a little bit of water. I want to make sure I have enough paint to cover the whole area that I need to cover with this color. So I'm really darkening up those edges where the shadow, where the egg is turning towards the shadow. I'm going to remove some, blot on the paper towel. And you notice the value on my brush is now lighter as I swipe along that edge. I'm going to remove most of it, dry on the towel, and then soften. So I think, in my opinion, this is just my opinion because it's a technique I don't use as often as wet and wet, but I think that painting wet and dry does require a bit more work because with these multiple layers of glazing, you have to go in and manually soften everything. Let's dry that one. And it's a slightly different look than when we painted wet on wet, the colors blended on the paper here versus here. We are pre-mixing our values over here in the palette and then applying them directly on. Now we're going to take a little of our burnt sienna. This is going to be a final layer to darken on the shadow side. And I think we got the values really close to our wet on wet egg, so that was what we were going for here. Removing that, drying on the paper towel, and we soften. It gets a little easier to soften the more layers you put down, I think. Just be careful not to press too hard with your brush. You don't want to lift any paint out of your paper. You just want to blend what's there. If you want to add any additional layers of blue, you can do that wet and dry. Again, you can see me blotting on the paper towel and softening. So there you can see the difference between the two eggs. This one was wet on dry. This one was wet on wet. Wet on dry versus wet and wet. They look pretty similar. This one was painted way faster. Alright, it's just one final little thing to make this feel like a more finished painting. I'm going to mix my burnt sienna with my marine blue, more burnt sienna than blue. So I have a rich chocolatey gray, and I'm just going to paint some suggestions of the nest that these little eggs are sitting in. This is wet on dry. There is so much value to using both of these techniques, and for most subject matter I find that I have to use wet on dry, at least for some of the details at the end. With this egg, I really didn't need that just because it's a smooth surface. But when you're painting something like an animal with soft fur, you can use wet on wet for most of the washes. And then at the end, when you add the eyes, the nose, the whiskers, things like that, you're going to need to use wet on dry. So there is a time and a place for each of these techniques, but you can see that they both work equally well for the same subject matter, at least for those initial washes. For the nest, I'm just mixing some indigo and burnt sienna, adding a variety of dark and light. Still just working wet and dry here. There we go. Now if you hadn't just seen this demonstration, could you tell the difference? Which one was wet and wet, which one was wet and dry? I think it's pretty hard to tell. A lot of artists prefer to use wet on wet for almost the entire painting just because they love those soft diffuse edges, and a lot of artists really love the control of using wet on dry and being able to just glaze and layer and layer. I really like to use a combination of both techniques. Most of my paintings involve washes using wet and wet, and then I save the wet on dry for details at the end. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully it helped clarify a few things about these two different techniques. Thanks for watching today. Check out this other video about how to improve your values in watercolor, and I'll see you over there.